right, good afternoon. Thanks for being here right after lunch. I have this lovely spot of being here right after you've eaten your meal. And there is coffee in the back. You're going to need it because we're going to do a little lesson on economics. So my presentation is a little bit different from the ones that you heard earlier today. So just a little shameless plug, that's the University of Colorado Boulder. That's about what it looks like every day of the summer. It's one of the sunniest places that I've ever lived. I'm going to talk to you today about the economic resiliency study that we completed in Colorado last year. And I think there's some conclusions here that can be transferable really to any state in the nation. But first, let's start out by just taking a look at where we are in this economic recovery. We entered the Great Recession in 2007, and you can see on this slide month-over-month job growth, or during the recession, job losses. We were losing almost 800,000 jobs per month at the worst of it. And in about 2010, we started to grow jobs again. We started adding jobs month over month on average at about a rate of 88,000 per month. And this job growth accelerated through 2014. And then in 2015, the pace of growth waned a little bit, so we're still adding jobs, but at a decreasing rate. And in 2016 and 2017, it has slowed and slowed more again. So that slowing, I think, isn't necessarily a reflection of our economy sinking, but more of a reflection of us entering full capacity. We're seeing the unemployment rate come down to about 4.3%, which is lower than our long-term average for unemployment rate. We've seen the labor utilization rate, or the U6 unemployment rate, come down to below its long-term average as well. So I think when we take a look at a number of factors within our economy, it's at a much healthier spot. U.S. employment is over 5% above its previous peak for total employment. But when we take a look at economic recovery, and particularly employment recovery by state nationally, it's a little bit of a mixed story. So some states like North Dakota and Colorado and Texas and Utah, those states have the best employment recoveries in the nation. They have the most growth above their pre-recession peak, but that's not true everywhere. There's 6 states that are below their peak employment levels that they saw leading up to the recession, and that's been a little bit of a problem nationally, and Alabama is one of those states that has still not recovered jobs lost from the recession. So let's bring this down to a one-year view, and the story is very similar, where most states are adding jobs year over year, but there are still 6 states, different states from the last slide, but 6 states that are losing jobs year over year. And there's a common thread through most of these states that are losing jobs, like Wyoming and Alaska and West Virginia and Oklahoma and even Louisiana to some extent. These are states that have very energy-intensive economies. But nonetheless, they are suffering economically right now. So now let's zoom into Alabama. So nearly 3/4 of rural counties in Alabama are showing year-over-year growth, and 6 out of 7 urban counties within Alabama are showing year-over-year growth. But nonetheless, 14 Alabama counties are showing year-over-year employment declines right now. And when we take a look at the covered employment, so this data set excludes sole proprietors, but the promising story here is that the rural part of the state, so I'm focusing on just rural Alabama now, the rural part of the state has recorded 51 months of consecutive year-over-year job growth. So if you take a look at that slope right in the middle, that was the peak leading up to the Great Recession, and then rural Alabama lost 13% of employment. The nation lost about 6.3%. So it was much harder in rural Alabama. And now it's a real smooth increase, but employment is up about 4% from the trough following the recession, right about there. But it's still 9% below its previous peak. Interestingly, when we turn and look at wages, wages have more than recovered from the recession, and now total wages paid in the state in the rural areas are up 11% from the previous peak. And total wages grew 2.6% year over year in the rural areas. And even average wages, when we take a look at average wages in both urban Alabama and rural Alabama, average wages have been on an increasing trajectory, and they're up about 1.9% year over year through the end of 2016. So that's a fairly positive story that even on average wages are up. Okay, so why am I bringing this up? We did this study on economic resiliency. We focused on economic resiliency in rural Colorado. Rural Colorado has 47 counties out of the 64 in the state. But we also looked nationally for some context. So there's about 1,931 counties nationally that we would consider rural. Similar to the first presentation today, we looked at the definition from the USDA and pulled the metropolitan statistical areas from the Office of Management and Budget. And we looked at the factors. First, we measured what is resiliency, right? So resiliency could mean a few things. We were looking at economic resiliency, which you could also term economic stability or economic sustainability or economic growth, but just trying to measure how these places performed over time, given multiple shocks that they may have encountered. They could be natural disasters, they could be human-made disasters of some sort, maybe like a terrorist attack or something like that. It could just be a recession. How did they enter and exit from a recession? And first, by zooming out nationally, what we see over a 25-year period, in terms of population growth, we see that the Northwest and pockets in the East and Southeast have really outperformed population growth over this period. But if you take a look at the heartland in the U.S., many counties have been suffering. Not only are they on a flat trajectory, but they're actually losing people on average over this time period. We looked at average annual growth because it was a way to pick up the volatility in the growth and the declines. And so when we take a look at Alabama as a subset of this, there are 5 Alabama. So we sorted the 1,900 counties from fastest growth to slowest growth on average, and we broke them into 4 quartiles. So the top quartile is the 25% of this 1,900 that's growing the fastest, and the bottom quartile is the group that's growing the slowest, of course. Alabama has 5 counties in the top quartile for population growth over this period. 40% of Alabama's rural counties are in the top half for growth, and then 60% are in the slowest half for growth over this 25-year period. Now let's turn and look at employment growth, and what you'll see between these 2 slides is that there's a lot less red on the employment growth slide, meaning that we haven't seen the employment losses in all of the places that we're actually seeing population declines, which I think is kind of interesting. But the story is the same nonetheless for Alabama, and maybe even a little bit more severe, where only 2 Alabama counties are in the top quartile for employment growth. Only 25% are in the top half, and 75% of rural Alabama counties are in the bottom half of employment growth nationally. And here's just another way of looking at it when we index employment growth. So put every region on the same starting plane back in 1969 and measure how they've grown over time. We can see that rural America has underperformed the nation and underperformed urban America. But rural areas in Alabama have underperformed rural America when it came to employment growth over this period. And you can see coming out of the recession, all of the gray bars are recessions. Urban Alabama has recovered pretty well, but look at the flatness that we've seen in Alabama's rural areas. And when we take a look at percentage change for employment growth over the last 45 years, when we look at urban Alabama and rural Alabama and look at the recessions, one thing we note is that rural Alabama tends to get hit harder on the downturns, and rural Alabama also recovers less well on the upside compared to urban Alabama. So, I mean, that's kind of a dismal start to my story, right? But the good news is that I think there's some things that can be done about it. So now I'm going to bring it back to Colorado. We started this study in Colorado by taking a look at every economic metric we could think of. So like I showed you for employment and population, we looked at the standard deviation and growth in those metrics. We looked at personal income and housing price growth. So when we started with that to understand how places have performed compared to each other. And then we wanted to understand why. So we looked at assets. We looked at natural resources as assets. So we looked at, in Colorado, we looked at oil and gas development. We looked at coal. We looked at solar potential, wind potential. We looked at tourism amenities like rivers and mountains. And that gave us some understanding, and we did find that natural resources do tend to provide a competitive advantage for places. So if you have a rich resource, that's been a source of growth. But what was interesting when taking a look over this 25-year period, it didn't guarantee that you outperformed your cohort just because you had those natural resources. And the reason is because for a lot of these natural resources, they're commodity-based, and commodity prices are volatile, so they went through more boom and bust cycles. And especially for an industry like the coal industry that peaked in 2008 and has been declining, what was once a boon for those places is now an economic detriment for those places in Colorado. Then we looked at human-made resources. So what I'm talking about there is interstates, highways, community colleges, universities, correctional facilities, airports, all of these things that we build, hospitals, all of these things do also provide a competitive advantage. And when you think about it for universities, for instance, if that university or that college is at least a critical size, I'm saying, so in Colorado we have a couple of satellite campuses that maybe have 10 students. That's not a critical size. But if you have thousands of students, that is a critical size, where not only are your students getting a pathway to more education, but also those communities are importing youth from outside the community, and some of those youth will stay and be part of your community. So it's building your population with a younger demographic. But these assets do matter. They provide a little bit of a competitive advantage. But I mean, really, if we're taking a look at things like airports and colleges and correctional facilities and interstates, we're not really building that stuff anymore. So that table's already been set. So does that just mean that you either have it or you don't? So either you're on this path of growth or you're not? And so we tried to look at what else could matter, what else could make a difference. And I'm going to share with you a few of those stories. One of them is education. So all of the blue dots are the 47 rural Colorado counties. And what you can see here is, in the upper left quadrant, is the correlation between employment growth over 25 years and the percentage of your population that has a high school diploma. So people went on, this isn't their terminal degree. They have their high school diploma. Maybe they went on to college. Maybe they went on and got their graduate degree or their PhD. But there's a positive correlation there. Same with a bachelor's degree and same with a graduate degree. But if your terminal degree was less than a high school diploma, or if your terminal degree was a high school diploma, there's a negative correlation between employment growth and those terminal degrees. So why does this matter? We know that if you, with more education, you're more likely to participate in the labor force nationally. If you have a bachelor's degree, 75% of you are within the labor force, and your unemployment rate is less than 3%. It's about 2.5%. If you have less than a high school diploma, only about 47% of you are even in the labor force. And if you're in the labor force, your unemployment rate is 7.5%. Similar story with income growth. It's an upward trajectory for income and education. So education matters. And the nice thing about the education story is there's fewer barriers today for education than I think there ever have been. Because not only are there so many campuses nationally, but through online learning, we can continue our education without even having to leave our house. So that's a positive story. When we take a look at demographics, we look at the prime working age population, so the percentage of your population that's between 30 and 64 years old. And we find that the greater percentage of your population that's within that working age cohort, the faster your employment growth has been over time. So the question is, especially for rural areas that tend to be aging nationally, how do you grow that youthful population? How do you recruit people back to your small community that maybe when they turned 18 they were eager to leave and they never looked back? Well, there is a point as I interview people that from these communities where it is appealing for some of them to come back. They reminisce about the area that they grew up in, and they want to replicate that for their families. So how do you appeal to those people to come back to your community? And how do you ensure that there's some sort of opportunity for people when they get there? And then I'm going to talk about just a couple more metrics. I'm running short on time, but economic diversity. This is a really important one. So this slide is showing the correlation between employment growth and the percentage of your economy that is agriculture. And unfortunately, it's a negative correlation, which means the more agriculture you have, the slower path you've been on. And this could be for a couple of reasons. Agriculture is one of those industries, farming is one of those industries that's become much more productive over time. We've substituted equipment for people. We have much greater yields on our fields. And so perhaps it just takes fewer people to do it. But the other thing is, if you have 30, 40, or 50% of your value added coming from agriculture, that means you're not doing very much else in your community. So I think this is a missed opportunity where those communities should be able to leverage what they're doing on the grow side and do some sort of downstream product finishing before they send it out of their community. So if you can get one more round out of that corn or one more round out of that cotton or that beef and turn it into some sort of end user product before it leaves your community, that's a source of jobs and economic development within your community. So there's an opportunity. And lastly, to take a look at services. So we split it between goods and services. We know that services economies have been growing faster than goods producing economies. Agriculture would be included in goods. Manufacturing is in goods. Mining is in goods. And so we've seen the shift to services. What does this mean? I think there's a lot of services that communities can build up. Especially when you think about the advent of broadband and how even rural areas are able to get broadband. That provides an opportunity for a lot of the services-based industries and even location-neutral businesses. So people who want to live in a certain place but don't have to go into work, maybe they're doing software development, you're able to appeal to those people like you've never been able to in the past because they don't have to show up to a physical location for work. Or if you think about tourism as a services industry, tourism is an industry where we once had to rely on certain infrastructure. So maybe you had to wait for a Marriott or a Holiday Inn Express or a Ramada Inn to come and build in your community. But now with VRBO and Airbnb, you're able to leverage the assets that you have in your community and sell tourism anywhere in America like you've never been able to before. So that provides another opportunity. So just in closing, that was a look at the data. We also did focus groups in 20 communities around the state, and we knew that the data wasn't the end of the story, so we asked people in focus group settings what else matters. And we heard healthcare matters, mostly on the hospital side, because especially for rural communities, rural aging communities, those aging individuals want to ensure that they have health care available to them. And for young families, that's also top of mind too. They want to have health care locally. So we see rural communities in Colorado that are subsidizing hospitals just to ensure that they stay in their community and don't leave. Childcare is a barrier. Affordable housing has been a barrier almost universally across Colorado. But one of the things that we found that helps, that's somewhat of a soft skill, is leadership. We heard many stories and anecdotes about critical individuals. They could be elected officials, or they could be key business individuals or nonprofits who have come together to help build something in their community. If it's putting away land for some sort of industrial complex for down the road for building, if it's building a trail along the river, if it's saving the railroad and turning it into a tourism amenity. I mean, there are just countless stories where the communities that have been more successful in Colorado, they point to things that have been done in the past that are paying dividends today. And so these communities need to look at what they're doing today that will pay dividends down the road. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker, and I'll be up here in a little while to answer some questions for you.